So we're back on with Sheriff David Clarke, and before we left, we were kind of just talking about some of the changes and the differences that are kind of going on today in today's society versus when you were coming up in law enforcement. And so I want to kind of get into the kind of gun control, gun violence issue that has been pretty much dominating the topic of conversation over the last several years. And I remember when you first came on my radar, it was via your commercial you did about individuals not inherently just relying on police officers to be there to protect you when something arose, and that you should take your safety into your own hands in some respects by getting a firearm and learning how to use that firearm responsibly. And so what was your motivation behind putting that commercial out to begin with?
Well, first of all, the right of self-defense is a natural right, and it's the first law of nature. People want to survive. Over time in this country, probably over the last 40 years, we've been conditioned away from guns by the anti-gun movement in this country. It was never really questioned for the first 150 years of this country, the possession of firearms, weapons, so on and so forth. It was never a topic of debate and discussion. And then over time, what happened was we got separated from our history, the history of the Second Amendment and the role that it played in freedom and liberty in the United States. And also what I did was I went back, because I'm a student of history, I like to read about history, and I went back to read several books and articles on the history of the Second Amendment, especially as it related to black people.
Yeah.
And what I learned was one of the hallmarks of slavery was that blacks could not own arms. It was against the law to either arm a black or, Negroes at the time they called them, the slaves. They couldn't protect themselves from lynchings, mob beatings, and kidnappings. And even after the 13th Amendment was ratified that freed the slaves, there were still laws on the books in the Jim Crow South that prohibited people from selling firearms to black people or from black people possessing those things to guard against mob beatings, lynchings, and kidnappings. And it was people like Frederick Douglass. It was people like Ida B. Wells. It was people like Booker T. Washington, strong proponents of gun ownership so that blacks could defend themselves and their families. So I started reading up this history, and I'm learning a lot. I'm like, wow, we should be, as a people, we should be some of the biggest proponents and supporters of the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms, because of the role that it played in freeing the slaves. So even though the 13th Amendment freed the slaves on paper, it wasn't until the 14th Amendment was ratified. A lot of people don't know this. The whole idea behind the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, it said that the entire Constitution applies to the newly freed slaves, including the Second Amendment, and states could not come in and set up separate rules that would deny us, that Second Amendment right. Now that's been stretched. The 14th Amendment applies to all kind of nonsense today, but it was really about making the Constitution apply to us. And so when I looked at that, and I looked at what stalwarts in the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. was a gun owner and was strapped oftentimes because he was in fear of his life. But you look at people like the ones that I mentioned, and I thought these people died. These people shed blood so that future generations of black people could remain free because of the Second Amendment in order to defend themselves. And I thought, why would I give that back to? Why would I cede that right back to the federal government through gun control laws? So, I started to. And that's one of the big things that I find with too many people today is they don't know their history. I tell them, Colion, I tell them that all the time. I go, you don't know your history. Go back and read your history on the civil rights movement. Go back and look at the suffrage movement, not the suffrage, the abolitionist movement. Go back and study your history, and you'll have a different view of these things. So that's what I did. That's why my head is at where it is today.
Gotcha. And what I've noticed recently is there have been, when we start talking about the issues of the gun violence in, say, for instance, the inner city, there's almost kind of been this almost systematic attempt to, anytime you talk about firearms in the hands of black people, the only way you can see it, the only perspective that you can view it through is gang violence, drug violence, and things of that nature. When we talk about these inner city communities, at least from my understanding and knowledge that I have, from my perspective, the vast majority of these people in these places are good people. And then you have a very minority group of people in these communities that are causing a lot of trouble, doing the vast majority of the killing. So why do you think it is that when we talk about firearms in the hands of black people, we only talk about it through the lens or the eye of the violence of the inner city, instead of empowering the individuals in these communities to own their gun and to take advantage of their Second Amendment rights?
Because the issue has been co-opted by the anti-gun left. That's why. Because when I talk about firearms in the hands of all people, I talk about it in terms of self-defense. It is a right. You don't need to explain why you want to exercise a right. You know, I have a nice supply of firearms myself, and people would say, well, why do you need so many guns? I said, I don't need a reason to exercise my, any constitutional right. But what we're talking about really is, it's one of those urban pathologies that I talk about. When you see all this violence, it's a disproportionate number of blacks in terms of their relationship to the population at large, unfortunately. But these are the ones, the young men mainly, who are the victims and oftentimes the suspect, who have no respect for that firearm. They have no respect for other people. They would settle a dispute by violence. They would take property by force. They would threaten and intimidate their neighbors and friends with a firearm. It's just a total lack of, it's culturally dysfunctional, if you ask me. But you said something that I always bring out when I'm talking to people. The overwhelming amount of black people in these urban centers are good law-abiding people. They would never take a gun and fire it at a neighbor in dispute, take their car or their wallet, or their TV by force like that, or threaten and intimidate their neighbors and friends. And so we are talking about a small segment of the population, but the reason I said this thing was co-opted is because the anti-gun left looks at this and says, yeah, the gun's at the heart. If we just get rid of the guns. Well, what they want to do really, because theirs really isn't about violence reduction. Theirs is really, their true motive is gun confiscation. Yeah. So what they want to do is they want to punish the overwhelming majority of people, black, white, Hispanic, in the United States, Asian, you can name any demographic you want, who would never use a firearm in an irresponsible manner like that. So that is their true goal, is to punish them. I say let's punish the people who are using that tool. That's all a firearm is a tool. Yeah. Who are using, it'd be like if I took a chainsaw, started it up, and started swinging it indiscriminately in the air in a crowded tavern. You'd look at me like I'm nuts. I'm using that in a way that it was not designed to be, and therefore you should punish me. What would you want to put chainsaw manufacturers out of business because I went into a bar and used one in a very stupid fashion? And so when you pull back the layers on their argument, you can see what the true goal is, and it's total gun confiscation.
I'd even take it a step further and say just complete dependency, if we're going to talk about it like on an ideological level. I think in these communities, I think a lot of these communities are I think a lot of politicians and the leaders in these communities exploit the conditions in these communities by overstating the number of people engaged in the violence. And then as a result, kind of create this certain fear of just inherently the firearm and distracting people away from the idea that we were talking about individuals and not holding these individuals accountable for their actions like you just alluded to. I always look at the firearm as a symbol of self-reliance. And when you take that away, when you can take that away from somebody, and then in my mind, put somebody in a position of dependence, which I think full circle comes back to the commercial you did initially about the fact that, yes, we are here to protect you the best way that we can as officers. But you have to understand the reality in that if it takes us 15, 20 minutes to get to you and you're dealing with something in your house right now, you have to depend on your own ability to protect yourself until you guys can get there. And I think as long as they can create this notion and foster this idea of firearm ownership, black people, bad, we'll push away from the idea of firearm ownership and then continue to be dependent on the leadership that's continued to fail these communities as we've been seeing thus far.
Sure, and I reminded people too, don't outsource your personal protection to the government. First of all, the police are not omnipresent. They're not just a few blocks away. And sometimes when minutes, when seconds matter, the cops are minutes away. And so there are some smart things. I think it's a duty and responsibility, the way I termed it, you can do to protect yourself and your family. But now we're seeing the 911 system is overburdened.
Yeah. The
cops cannot keep up with all the calls for service. That means there's some very serious calls that are being put on the back burner in the queue, we like to call it. It's taking the police longer and longer periods of time to get there. That's no fault of the police. We don't have enough police anymore, and we don't live in a police state anyway.
Yeah.
I don't want a cop on every corner, but they cannot keep up with it. And so there's some smart, responsible things, I think, as a citizen of this country that a person should do. And I just started bringing that to the surface and get away from this notion of, well, just call 911, just call the police, just call 911. That may be effective in some situations, but it's not effective in every situation.
Absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree with you on that. But unfortunately, we are out of time. I wish we had, I think we can keep going about this for all day as far as I'm concerned. But I do really appreciate you taking the time to kind of visit with us here. You have an open invite. Whenever you want to come back on the show, just let us know. And I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
Absolutely. You have a good one.
Be well.
All right. When we come back, shooting champion, Taryn Butler.